I have been struggling to understand the US's strategy for Ukraine for a long time. Common sense dictates that the Ukrainian maximalist victory of pushing Russia out of Ukraine is near impossible at this point. I mean, they tried 3 times with 3 counteroffensives, all of which took massive casualties, destroyed billions of dollars in foreign equipment, and hasn't made a dent in Russia's land bridge. Ukraine has received over 40 billion US dollars in direct military aid so far, and another 14 billion carded to come. And well, we know my opinion about that. Just watch my last 3 videos, and yet nothing approximating a victory. So today I want to analyze a recent article written by a retired US Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who also served as a US Assistant Secretary for State for Political Affairs. And in my experience, once you see a former military man who has taken a political position in the Washington, D.C., his assessments tend no longer to be based on objective military facts, as harsh as they may be. The political role makes him very biased and tailors his opinions to fit a political narrative. And I think we will see that here, and we can extrapolate this lesson to others like Lloyd Austin and Generals Hodges and Petraeus, who all make statements that just mystify me at times with their delusion. So let's get into it. So the focus of today's video is an article from Politico entitled "How the West is Helping Ukraine Won't Be Enough to Win." A very sensible title, but in the article, the retired General Kimmitt advocates for removing the gloves, so to speak, and sending more aid, and more worryingly, advocates for the US permitting Ukraine to strike directly into Russia with long-range weapons. How does one think this can achieve any favorable outcome for the West, let alone a Ukrainian victory, behooves me. So Mr. Kimmitt refers to a military analyst named Seth Jones, who apparently experienced a 180-degree change in opinion about the outcome of this Ukraine war, and went from writing that the Russian army is collapsing.
I would just push the Russian military, the army in particular, is collapsing at the moment, and they're in serious trouble.
To what is described as a worrisome view that the Ukrainian army is in an increasingly perilous position against the Russian invaders. General Kimmitt agreed with Mr. Jones that what is needed is a clear strategy and a sustained supply of Western weapons, intelligence and training, or else Putin will prevail. So let's analyze General Kimmitt's strategy. Such a strategy, he says, would require at least 3 elements to slow and reverse Russia's advance. 1. The US and NATO allies would have to loosen the restrictive rules of engagement they placed on Western supplied equipment, allowing Ukraine to employ said equipment to its full potential. Britain has already eased the rules of engagement, but others impose restrictions preventing Ukraine from cross-border attacks and from attacking the crown jewels of the Russian deployment, such as the Black Sea Fleet. This must end, he says. Kimmitt says that concern over Russian escalation has, and get this, allowed the West to talk itself into inaction and self-deterrence. And here's where his analysis goes completely off the rails in my opinion. But if Israel's response to last month's Iranian drone and missile strike has demonstrated anything, it's that a strong response, not self-deterrence, is the best way to confront totalitarian threats. He says autocrats see restraint and caution as signs of weakness. They see strength in resolve. Okay, so in General Kimmitt's alternate reality, he assesses Israel's response to Iran's missile attack as a strong one that demonstrates a victory for Israel. Now I want to choose my sources carefully to rebut General Kimmitt's suggestion. So while Al Jazeera is a credible source, some would say they are pro-Iranian and pro-Palestinian. So let's look at Radio Free Europe's report, who is undoubtedly pro-Ukrainian, pro-Israeli, and quite frankly, pro-anything West generally. On April 19th, after Israel did their so-called response to Iran's missile attack, which as I had reported hit 3 targets in Israel that were supposed to be the most heavily guarded military facilities on the entire planet, Watch my video entitled Impossible. Israel's response to this missile attack, which by the way, recent reports revealed only 84% of Iranian missiles were shot down, and not the 99% claimed. Israel's response was summed up in this description by Radio Free Europe in the title of the article. Israel's limited attack on Iran appears aimed at de-escalating conflict. The article starts off like this. Israel had vowed to make Iran pay for Tehran's unprecedented drone and missile attacks on April 13th. And here's the important part. But Israel's suspected military response early on April 19th appeared to be limited in scale and scope and aimed at de-escalating tensions with Iran. So in stark contrast to General Kimmitt's claim that Israel's response demonstrated that a strong response is the best way to confront totalitarian threats, all the sources I have read have described Israel's response as timid, limited, and de-escalatory. Further, Israel failed to even claim ownership of the attack, and Iran claimed it amounted to a mere 3 drones, all of which were shot down. What was even more embarrassing was this report on April 16th before Israel's limited response, and it came from the Cradle, which claims that the US, and get this, made a failed bid for Iran to allow a symbolic strike by Israel. Now, to be fair, the source of this report is an Iranian security official who revealed that the US contacted the Islamic Republic asking the nation to allow Israel a symbolic strike to save face, but Iran outright rejected it. So I guess we can take it with a grain of salt. But when we look at Israel's response, i.e. sending 3 drones compared to their response in Gaza after October 7th, coupled with their return to its invasion into Rafah, it does seem that Israel has conceded defeat to Iran. Let's get back to the article. My point is that this retired US general is basing his advice for Ukraine and Washington on a flawed assessment of the recent Iranian-Israeli escalations. But the more worrying question is what he does not factor at all into his advice, i.e. that all restraints on the supply and use of Western equipment in Ukraine be removed, is the fact that Russia is a nuclear power, and thus any such escalation will prompt Russia to escalate further in response, which, as we have seen in the past with Russia's destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, would only lead to more damage and harm to Ukraine. This just evinces to me that these Western generals only see Ukraine as a battering ram or cannon fodder. It is unclear to me how this strategy will achieve victory for Ukraine. His entire analysis is based on what occurred between Israel and Iran, which to me was a defeat for Israel. So here is his second point. He says it's time to take greater risks with the US and Western military stocks. While the supplemental aid package allowed President Biden to dip into existing inventories of weapons and ammunition, a vast amount of ready and lethal equipment remains held back for other worldwide contingencies, training and testing. He then says that failure in Ukraine could encourage the very war our soldiers in places like Korea stand ready to fight. Adversaries like North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he says, take note of US hesitancy to back friends and allies. So does China, as it peers across the Taiwan Strait. President Zelensky needs more ammunition, and commanders like La Camera should see the consequences of their own missions should Ukraine fall to Russia, even if the cost comes out of their inventories. So in summary, the retired general is arguing that the US remove all restraints on sending weapons to Ukraine, but yet he doesn't articulate whether this can help Ukraine win, or to what end will this weaponry help.
Я думаю, братан, что это, блядь. Всем уже на все похуй, блядь. Мы же с тобой нихуя, во-первых, не решаем. Во-вторых, это, походу, последние дни, блядь.
That's the elephant in the room, and it's made even more illuminating with these 2 things. First, his later assessment that I am about to read, which to me pokes gaping holes in his advice. And second, I will play at the end of this video a clip of an interview with the General Kimmitt, which to me raises a lot of the questions I have about his advice. So first, the general goes on to say that the Ukraine war has unmasked a major problem in war fighting logistics. Even if the supplemental had been passed in October last year, we now know that US military production base and that of its European allies is too small to support even a mid-sized conventional war like Ukraine, he admits. A second war would be disastrous, he says. For example, he says that through Herculean efforts, the US doubled its production of artillery rounds to 28,000 per month, but the Russians fire on average 10,000 rounds per day. Directly says that Russia increased its military production full force, stunning analysts with its rapid expansion, and is now said to be the leading sector of the Russian economy. He then says that Russian units on the front lines may be enduring horrific casualties, but it's not from a lack of logistics. So then what are these supposed horrific casualties from, I ask? If Ukraine is low on ammo, and disastrously so, as all Western reports have said since January of this year, and low on manpower, yet in contrast, Russia has no issue with logistics or manpower, then how does that equation lead to horrific casualties for the Russians? My second question is, the general's reasoning for removing the restraints and sending all aid and money that the US can muster to Ukraine would be less expensive than losing the war because of the fact that Russia outproduces the West, and thus, if a second war were to occur in Europe, it would be disastrous for the West. The illogicality is patent. If you admit that the West doesn't have the production capacity to match Russia in Ukraine, particularly in the most important armament Ukraine needs, artillery shells, then what good is sending less useful weapons to Ukraine at this point? It keeps coming back to the same point I made. What is the end goal of these weapons? The general has not discussed any avenue or strategy for Ukrainian victory. He seems to think that sending more weapons to a beleaguered Ukrainian army that can't even defend their own current defense lines will somehow prevent a second war, on the unsubstantiated speculation that Russia will engage in another war with Europe when they defeat Ukraine. What about seeking peace and saving Ukrainian lives? What about the fact that the US cannot afford to fight two large wars at the same time, Gaza and Ukraine? What about the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons and Iran may be able to acquire them very soon? When I see this type of astonishingly illogical analysis from some of the highest ranking US officials and military experts, it suggests to me that they must have an agenda. So I did some research on the retired General Mark Kimmitt, and here's what I found. Just as I suspected, it seems that this retired general, who later took up a political post in Washington, is involved and likely has a stake in the US arms industry. That's why he's promoting more weapons and more war without a logical base. It benefits either him or his employer. Look at this article from NPR in 2011. It reads as follows. The outcome of popular revolts in the Arab world is yet to be determined, but they have already forced the United States to reconsider sales to the region. The article was about weapons sales and the increasing relationship between Gaddafi and Libya with the US back then. It continues to read that Gaddafi actually moved closer to the US in recent years and was rewarded with some new trade deals. And here's where the retired General Kimmitt fits in. The general said, and I quote, "It was a promising market because we saw it as a promising relationship." Says Mark Kimmitt, a retired US Army Brigadier General. He directed, and look at this, security assistance programs of the US Military Command from 2004 to 2006, and later served as Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs. That is the very same security assistance program from which all of the supposed 61 billion in Ukraine aid is coming from. So this is my point. Most of these Western officials who advocate for more and more arms to Ukraine without any strategy for victory and without any long-term goal are doing so because it serves their own agenda and not from objective military analysis. So the general goes on to advocate that the Biden administration must remind the American people of the costs of failure in Ukraine, and that there must be a major information campaign to address the serious imbalance in the manpower in this war, as Russia, he says, currently has a 3-to-1 advantage in available military manpower. So what are you saying here, General? Are you suggesting that the US must send troops to Ukraine to help alleviate this manpower imbalance? And that Biden must launch an information campaign to encourage this? But why? What are the stakes for failure in Ukraine that he speaks about? Well, aside from a wild speculation of a secondary war in Europe, which I am yet to see any evidence for, the general remains silent. So here's how he finishes his analysis. A congressional supplemental was necessary, but it isn't enough to reverse the deteriorating situation in Ukraine. It's time to loosen the handcuffs, he said, we have placed on Zelensky, and let him use the weapons and equipment that we provide. It's time to take the risks with our wartime stockpiles and give Zelensky what his soldiers needs. Sir, respectfully, his soldiers need artillery shells, which you have admitted the US can't produce enough of. The general says it's time to remind his country of what Putin tells his country every day, that a loss in Ukraine is a threat to our own security. It's time to take the gloves off. Well, sir, if the US does what you ask, in a war that Ukraine has already lost strategically and will likely lose definitively this year, all the while fighting another in Israel that the US is also losing, by the way, as admitted by Israeli media, you're advocating for the death of America, the bankruptcy of America. That's my opinion. But you're clearly bought or stipended politician in service of the US arms industry as revealed by your past. So let's take a look at this interview with the general on Bloomberg. And even though the interviewers were soft on him in my opinion, it still revealed the illogicality of his strategy. He admits that the recent aid won't be enough for a Ukrainian counteroffensive and may only help Ukraine defend, but then he advocates for a Ukrainian counteroffensive next year. Then when he's asked about whether Ukraine can achieve victory, he avoids answering the question directly. But then he admits that the aid package is really a mere morale boost package for Ukraine, which is exactly what I said in my last video right here. So let's have a look.
Ukraine to turn this around, get back on the offensive, or is this now about strengthening Ukraine's hand for the negotiating table?
Well, I think it will allow Ukraine to defend the front lines for this fighting season. I don't think we're at the point where this aid alone will allow them to conduct a counteroffensive. But I think that we've got to realize that Russia is making gains, and the most important thing is to stop those gains, to reinforce the lines. We've got to make sure that the Russians can't advance much further. I believe that we'll get the ammunition there much quicker than the Stimson Center believes.
Yeah.
I think if we were smart, and I think DOD is smart, they've pre-positioned much of that ammunition already in pre-positioned stocks. So I think it'll get to the battlefield quickly, but there is still a massive numerical advantage on the part of the Russians right now in terms of ammunition and personnel for that matter.
Okay, so when you say this fighting season, what length of time are we realistically talking about that this will support Ukraine for? Because it was really hard to get this done. It took months. I have no idea if it's likely that something like this could get done again. So how long does this give Ukraine before it would need to be re-upped?
Well, the fighting season starts in the late fall. Things get muddy. Russia calls it mother mud as one of their greatest defensive capabilities. So I think between now and October is the time that the focus of the Ukrainians ought to be to defend and then use the winter time to get ready for a counteroffensive in 2025. I said that 2 years ago, and we didn't have much of a counteroffensive in 2023. So I think Ukraine will be lucky to hold out until 2025 in order to do a counteroffensive of any kind.
If that's the case, you've got lawmakers here, and we hear this, Kaylee, on a regular basis on this program, asking for an exit plan. At what point are we talking about the negotiating table?
Well, that's really up to President Zelensky and how long he wants to hold out. I think we've got to understand if he starts calling for negotiations right now, Vladimir Putin will love those calls for negotiations. And you can bet the terms will be tough and the terms will be harsh. I don't think we're at the point now where Zelensky needs to do that. The most important thing the supplemental does is give him a morale boost and his troops a morale boost to keep fighting for some time longer.
But I guess it's still, we return to the question we've really been asking since this conflict began, General, which is Ukraine capable of outright winning this war? Or do we only need to think in terms of what a mediated victory could look like?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think we've been doing everything in the United States to prevent them from having a victory. This shackling that we have done, the restrictions that we put on the equipment that we provide to them, the low, slow pace of weapons getting into them, I think has been as helpful to a Russian victory as Vladimir Putin being able to turn his entire military defense complex back on.